Earlier this week, I interviewed David Wallace Wells about the climate and the sort of urgent nature of what is taking place currently and the seemingly intractable situation that we're up against with when it comes to protecting the environment and protecting humanity from humanity effectively and the effect that we are having on the climate and on the planet via industrialization and pollution and burning of fossil fuels. For today's classic interview, we're going to go back to my interview with David Keith from a couple of years ago, where we spoke about geoengineering. We didn't speak about geoengineering in the conspiratorial sense. We spoke about it in the sense of as a climate change mitigating mechanism. Let's check out that interview right now. I'm joined today by David Keith, who is professor of engineering and of public policy at Harvard University. You've worked in the fields of climate science, energy technology, you've been in public policy. It's so interesting now what we are seeing with regard to, I think that geoengineering is sort of crossing a lot of these areas that you've worked in, and it's touching on a lot of different aspects that are increasingly present sort of in the national narrative. Let's start for people who don't know what we're talking about. What's geoengineering?
So the idea of solar geoengineering is the idea that humanity might deliberately make the Earth a little bit more reflective by some technological means, like putting some kind of aerosol, a fine dust, into the stratosphere, perhaps, and that would partially and imperfectly and impermanently offset some of the risks, the climate risks that come from the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere.
And is this just in terms of preventing temperature increases, or are there other potential benefits?
Certainly not just temperature. Climate change is a whole host of things, from changes in extreme temperature, changes in rainfall patterns, changes in sea level, changes in the impacts on the natural environment, on species and ecosystems. And the evidence, which is certainly comes with lots of uncertainty, but the evidence is that a moderate amount of solar geoengineering, something that, say, cut the overall rate of climate change, or if warming, if you like, in half, would reduce changes both in temperature, but also reduce increases in precipitation, perhaps reducing the increase in extreme storms that are the things particularly destructive to the poorest people in the world.
Specifically, how would this be done? In other words, what would be the sort of technological mechanisms that would be used to carry out such a policy?
So in some ways, that's the easiest part. The hard questions are mostly all about governance and science.
Well, we'll get to
I
that.
think yeah, exactly. But I think it's reasonably clear that at least in this one method, putting aerosols in the stratosphere, that really existing technologies, essentially existing aircraft technologies, could be used to put, say, some amount that would ramp up from zero gradually to maybe over sort of 25 or 50 years to something like 1 million tons a year of material going into the stratosphere, and that could be done really with off-the-shelf aircraft technology that many nations could access and could be supplied by many vendors. So kind of variants of the technology that you see in a business jet, nothing all that fancy. So the basic ability to get materials to the stratosphere is something that can be done at costs that aren't very different from the costs of shipping materials by air freight across the Pacific.
One of the criticisms that I've read of this type of geoengineering is that although it might be effective in terms of the mitigation of climate change, that there are all sorts of other negative potential environmental repercussions depending on what specifically is used as an aerosol. Have the developments accelerated in terms of solving that issue over the last several years versus maybe in the early 90s when there were earlier discussions of this technology?
I think the big perspective here is that because of concerns, some I think very well founded and legitimate, and some maybe a little bit kind of at the gut level, because of concerns about this technology, there isn't a large organized research program. So, for example, although the United States is often seen as a place of sort of technological optimism, justifiably so, and although there's a huge overall budget for climate research of several billion a year, not counting all the money that we spend, and we should spend much more, in my opinion, on cutting emissions, there has been no organized U.S. government research of any kind on solar geoengineering, and very little globally. There's small research programs now in Europe and China, and some in the U.S. I helped to run one, but they're funded dominantly by philanthropic money, at least ours is, because there's been very, very little government money. So the important answer at this point is that we don't know very much. There's plenty, and I can tell you some of what we do know. But to be clear, the argument that I and I think many people like me are making is not that we ought to do geoengineering. I think that would be ridiculous. The argument is that we ought to have a serious, coordinated, open access research program to understand more about how well it would work, what the risks are, how we'd control it.
On the internet, if you were to, for example, prepare with for an interview with someone like you and research geoengineering, you would inevitably come across all sorts of conspiracy theories about geoengineering. Sometimes the term climate engineering is used. You will then probably go down the internet rabbit hole into chemtrails, and I've interviewed one or two of the chemtrails conspiracy
Yeah.
theorists. How did this start that geoengineering became so tied into some of the, I guess I would call them, not making a value judgment, but merely from the way that the material is presented, some of the juiciest conspiracy theories on the internet? How did this develop?
I don't know is the short answer. I think, from what I understand, there were long held beliefs by probably a very tiny number of people that the US government was sort of deliberately manipulating the ionosphere through something called the HARP program, which was actually a pretty normal, nerdy physics program to try and beam microwaves into the ionosphere. And a bunch of related programs that people who kind of want to see some nefarious coordinated action imagined were happening. And then as the more public discussion of solar geoengineering began to be more visible, say a decade ago, those two ideas were somehow conflated. I don't know why. What I think is clear is that the extraordinary spread of social media has really changed the way these things work. So that there's much more, it's much easier to produce fake news, as we've seen in lots of countries, including the US in the last few years. It's much easier to produce materials that appear to naive viewers to be convincing. And so you can get many more people falling into the trap of believing stuff that, objectively to the mainstream seems really bizarre and extraordinarily unlikely to be true. And that's true on all sorts of cases, but this is certainly a particularly odd one. And it stirs up a pretty high level of hatred and anger on the internet. And I think it probably will affect the kind of normal discussion of geoengineering, which itself is controversial, but in totally different ways.
Let's talk now a little bit about the sort of politics and governance issues around this. I mean, certainly, I think we can all imagine how if you go up into the sky and you start spraying aerosols or whatever it is ultimately used, those aerosols are not going to respect these imaginary lines on maps called country borders. So logistically, who needs to agree to such a program? What are the sort of governance obstacles that would be presented?
It's a very hard question, and it's an emerging question. I mean, for all of these global public goods, and I think that's ultimately what this is, if it makes any sense, including goods that, of course, like any of them, have some risks and side effects. The way we manage them is is a work in progress. So that's true for managing pollution in the ozone layer. It's true for managing global climate. It's true for managing infectious diseases and all sorts of things. So there isn't a simple formula for what's legitimate. Obviously, international organizations matter, but so do coalitions of individual countries. And I think it will be some mixture of what some individual countries do, what environmental groups or other transnational public organizations do, and what the international organizations like the United Nations do. So it's really hard to guess. What I think is really hopeful is there are now serious emerging efforts to look at how that governance would work. So, for example, a guy called Janos Pastor, who is the lead advisor to the Secretary General for Climate, is now running an effort to try and develop governance for solar geoengineering.
One of the concerns that I have that I know is shared by at least some people in my audience with regard to whatever we may ultimately decide to do to try to deal with human caused climate change is that rather than taking a development like geoengineering or a new form of energy, whatever the case may be, and saying, okay, now we can use this to actually make a net improvement to what we're doing to the climate, that it will be seen, at least by some, as sort of carte blanche to keep doing exactly what we're doing, right? Saying, hey, now instead of just
Yeah.
improving the situation, we'll keep doing what we're doing, but we won't be doing as much damage because we've come up with this new thing. How do we deal with that?
Well, I mean, I think that is the central fear that beyond any other has held back research in this topic. And I think there's ways in which it's both deeply legitimate and some ways that it's less so. So yeah, of course, there will be some interest, for example, in parts of the fossil fuel industry. They would like to keep the party going and not reduce fossil fuel consumption. The hard truth is that if you want a stable climate, you have to bring fossil fuel consumption to zero eventually. And nothing about solar geoengineering changes that. You must bring emissions to zero in the net. Solar geoengineering can reduce the risks of climate change for CO2 that's already in the air, but it can't eliminate them. And so I think it's certainly true that some forces allied with, say, the fossil fuel industry that doesn't want to see climate regulation might use the possibility of solar geoengineering as an excuse for inaction. But the question is, how powerful those forces really be? In the end, the political forces that want to see our climate protected need to win anyway. And I think gradually we are beginning to win. We are beginning to win the battle to restrict CO2 emissions. And I don't think that adding something that further reduces, perhaps significantly reduces, the risks to the most vulnerable on the planet, which is what solar geoengineering could do, I don't think that in the long game, that suddenly means that we lose the political ability to cut emissions. But I agree it's a legitimate and hard question.
All right, something we will be dealing with certainly for years to come. We've been speaking
Okay.
with David Keith, professor of engineering and of public policy at Harvard University. Thanks so much for talking to us about this.
Thanks a lot. It's great to be on your show.